welcome. My name is Anna. I'm an FASD Prevention Program Coordinator with the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute, and I live on the homeland of the Cree, Dakota, and Métis Nations on Treaty 6 land. I would like to take this time to honor these and all Indigenous nations from Turtle Island who have been the caretakers and one with this land for millennia. I am glad to partner today with the Canada FASD Research Network to bring to you this webinar about early life adversity and FASD. First, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items before we get going. So we are recording this presentation and it will be available on the CanFASD YouTube channel and the SPI website. And this Zoom has the Q&A function, so participants can ask questions there and upvote those questions so that the most common will rise to the top. So feel free to send your questions at any time. And at the end of the presentation, I'll pose the questions to the speakers. Now I'd like to quickly introduce our wonderful presenters, Dr. Jacqueline Pei and Dr. Katherine Flannigan. Dr. Jacqueline Pei is a professor in the Department of Educational Psychology and assistant clinical professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Alberta. Also a practicing registered psychologist for the past 20 years, Dr. Pei began her career as a criminologist and forensic counselor working with incarcerated youth. Motivated by this early work, she returned to academia to study youth at risk, child development, and neuropsychology, leading to her current focus on interventions for individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Dr. Pei has over 75 peer-reviewed publications, but places the greatest value on her work with various communities and government agencies. To this end, Dr. Pei currently leads the Intervention Network Action Team, INET, for the Canada FASD Research Network, a role that facilitates the link between research, policy, and practice. Dr. Katherine Flannigan received her PhD in School and Clinical Child Psychology from the University of Alberta and completed a postdoctoral research fellowship in pediatrics at the University of British Columbia. She is currently a research associate with the Canada FASD Research Network, as well as a registered psychology in the provinces of Alberta and British Columbia. Dr. Flannigan has been working in the field of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, both through research and clinical practice for the last 15 years. She's especially interested in the biopsychosocial implications of atypical brain development, as well as environmental factors and intervention approaches that help to support positive outcomes for individuals and their families. Without further ado, I'm pleased to pass it to both of you, Drs. Jackie and Katie.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anna, for that lovely introduction. Katie and I are both very excited to be here today and join you. And, you know, Katie, every time I hear an introduction about you, I'm like, oh, that's a new piece of information. It's really nice when you can work with somebody for a few years and still learn new things in the introduction.
There you go. Full of surprises, Jackie.
Yes, that's why we do these things.
Yes.
So Katie is going to share our presentation with everyone, and we've decided that hopefully in the interest of efficiency, that she would run the presentation, which means even as we flip back and forth, Katie will be the one who's controlling things. Others will tell you that it's because when I control things, things go wrong. But anyway, which means I will kind of wave around, and if you see my hands flapping and things like that when I'm talking, I'm a bit of a hand flapper anyway, but in particular, I'll be signaling Katie to shift our slides. How does that sound, Katie?
Sounds great.
Wonderful. So we're really excited to join everyone here today. Thank you, Anna, again, so much for having us. This is a topic that both Katie and I have been really interested in for a number of years in terms of better understanding individuals with FASD, and importantly, being in a position where we can respond in meaningful ways. That's really, I think, where we get excited is what does it mean, the so what of it. So thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. We've already had some introductions. You heard a little bit, and Katie and I, I'll add in, have had the opportunity to work together now for gosh, a long time. I'm not going to do the math, Katie, because I just don't like to think about those numbers, but it's been a long time. And it's such a pleasure to have the opportunity to be here chatting with her today and sharing this information. We're hoping to be, as much as Zoom allows, a little bit fluid in our conversation with you today, but in a somewhat organized way. So we'll see how this rolls out. Wonderful, thank you. So today what we're hoping to do is first start by discussing a little bit about FASD and adversity, sort of just some big picture items, and some of it's just going to be a lot of review, and we're going to just make sure that we're all on the same page. Then Katie's going to talk us through the research study that we did specific to individuals with FASD and adversity, and share with you some of the data that we found, and some of the things that we think are really important or that really resonated for us through that study. Then what we're going to do is shift into consideration about how this information tells us a little bit about how important environments are and what that means in terms of opportunities that we have for intervention and next steps. So that's kind of the lay of the land. That's what we hope to do. And, I'll just give you the heads up that at the end, we're really hoping that this creates some space for us, not just to have questions and answers, but importantly, to have a conversation and discussion about how we all see our roles in supporting individuals with FASD in terms of promoting these healthy environments. So I plant that seed so folks know that we're going to be really excited to hear some of their input and ideas and thoughts around that. Is that my shift? See, there's a, pooh. Okay, I'll be trying all these things. So we want to start by just reminding ourselves of the complexities of FASD. So before we start talking about the environment, let's remember some of the neurodevelopmental impacts of prenatal alcohol exposure. They are many and they are diverse. Individuals with FASD may present with problems in their motor skills, their neurophysiology, their IQ development may be lower than is typical for their age. Language, academics, memory, inattention, executive dysfunction, problems in affect regulation, and difficulties in their adaptive and social skills. These are the categories that we look at when we're assessing individuals for an FASD diagnosis, and are some of the areas that we consider that may be impaired by prenatal alcohol exposure. The reason we wanted to review these and start ourselves in this place is to remember the significant and severe impact of that prenatal alcohol exposure, because this fundamentally changes the structure of the brain for an individual with FASD. So even before we start to consider environment and think carefully about environmental impacts, first, we're thinking about the brain of that individual that's living within this environment. And we're seeing diverse presentation and significant impairment in cognitive functioning. I'll figure out a way. I know I was supposed to do my nose subtle rub. FASD is a unique disability. We talk about that prenatal alcohol exposure. We appreciate the complex and diverse impacts on the developing brain, but those are not the only things that make FASD complex. Instead, there are many other social complexities that change the presentation. It's interesting, and I think, Andrew, if you're going to add papers to the side, maybe one of the things that you can add is that related to the unique complexities of FASD. We're often in a position where we're talking about what makes FASD unique. And one of the things that does is the social complexities, including some of the social roots or the intergenerational impacts of trauma, the effect of stigma in terms of how alcohol use is viewed and interpreted within our society, family experiences and complexities that exist within families, mental health that's highly overrepresented within the FASD population, and associated and related to many of these different pieces, elevated experiences of adversity. These things intersect and weave into each other to influence the presentation or the behavior that we might observe when we're working with our individuals with FASD. So flipping into the actual adversity piece. So I'm going to just focus on that now that we've kind of set that broad tone. One of the terms that I'm sure many of you are familiar with is double jeopardy. This is the language that we use to describe the intersection of these brain-based impacts that I just reviewed briefly earlier, as well as that postnatal adversity. So the fact that the brain is affected by alcohol in utero increases the vulnerability or sensitivity to stress. So when we put environmental adversity with those brain-based impacts, what we see is accumulation of impact, a sensitive brain that is impacted by that environment disproportionately. As a result, we see higher rates of difficulties in daily living for those individuals who have a combination of prenatal alcohol exposure as well as adversity. We see elevated rates of school disruptions, inappropriate behavior as contextualized by our social expectations, increased rates of things like employment challenges or transitioning to adulthood in successful ways, difficulties meeting independent living needs or attaining and maintaining housing, mental health, substance use challenges, and trouble with the law. This is a long list, and it's a list that many of us are used to when we talk about adverse outcomes, or sometimes it's referred to still as secondary disabilities associated with prenatal alcohol exposure or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. What we really want to talk about and focus on today is that these difficulties often occur, or more disproportionately occur, as a result of that intersection between those brain-based vulnerabilities and environmental adverse experiences. What does an early life experience and adverse experience look like? This may include things like disruptions in caregiving environments, death of a parent, child welfare involvement, which may involve any number of instabilities such as multiple moves, separation from parents, any kind of exposure to a traumatic experience. This can include things like abuse, neglect, but also some of these familial separations or exposure to things like substance abuse or use within a home environment. Early life experiences that are considered adverse can be many, and oftentimes are contextualized within that unique experience of the child. So what constitutes adverse can be varied and can be child central. That said, we still try to operationalize those kinds of factors that we think are, generally speaking, adverse for most people across most contexts. And then putting it all together, as I already said, these elements create increased vulnerability for individuals with FASD. The sensitive stress response system, combined with the environmental adversity, creates the double jeopardy referred to earlier. That said, as we're going to talk a little bit more about after Katie tells us a bit more about the study, there are protective factors that are identified within environments. Those include things like a stable and nurturing home, early identification of FASD, and access to services and supports. So we're going to think a little bit more about what those look like and what the research has told us about the potential benefit of environment and how we can leverage environment to think about this sensitive period as not just a time of vulnerability, but a time of opportunity. So again, I like to plant seeds. We'll come back to some of that a little bit, but first I want to turn it over to Katie, and I want her to tell you a little bit more. Now that we kind of have a little bit of the backstory, we're on the same page. I want to turn it over to Katie to talk a little bit about the study we conducted, wherein as we considered how important environments are and how adversity can affect individuals with FASD, we wanted to understand a bit more about the specifics as to what is going on for individuals with FASD. So, Katie, I'm going to pass that over to you, let you take over and tell everybody a bit about this study.
Thanks, Jackie. So Jackie provided a really nice overview of kind of the broad literature, or these broad ideas that we want to think about when we're talking about adversity and FASD, and in particular, the kind of cumulative impacts that the brain-based consequences of prenatal alcohol exposure can have in combination with these environmental experiences. And so before I dive into the specifics about our study, I wanted to provide some additional context around this concept of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, as I'm sure many, most, or all of you probably have heard about already. So just kind of backing it up a few decades, some really classic research done in California, I believe, Jackie, in the 1990s, researchers did a massive study where they surveyed nearly 10,000 adults in the United States, and they wanted to look at the relationship between experiences of early childhood adversity and what happens in adulthood. So they surveyed like 900 and some thousand adults, and they asked them about their experiences between 0 and 18. So what they really wanted to look at were events that were traumatic or extremely stressful, or that were believed to be traumatic and very stressful, which, and the hypothesis was that these experiences or events would really have a significant and profound impact over the lifespan. And indeed, what they found was that the adults who had higher rates of early adverse experiences did have poorer outcomes in terms of health, behavior, well-being, mental health, substance use, a whole host of negative outcomes that were associated with these early life experiences. And so in combination with the brain-based differences of prenatal alcohol exposure, these extra layers of vulnerability are really, really relevant for this population. And so we do know in general population that ACEs have a significant and profound long-term impact on a human being's development. Surprisingly, given that there is some emerging research around adversity in FASD, this is a relatively understudied area in the context of FASD. And there have only been a couple of studies that have specifically and systematically looked at ACEs within this context. Some of the studies that have kind of indirectly maybe looked at early life trauma and adversity within the context of FASD have found that across the lifespan, things like the type of placement that a child lives in, whether or not that individual has been disrupted in terms of their caregiving environment, these events early in life can and do have a significant impact later in life in terms of early attachments, behavioral problems or behavioral manifestations, I guess, development in terms of social emotional functioning, mental health concerns. And then in this last study that I'm referencing here on the bottom of the slide, researchers did a very large scale study looking at trauma broadly in childhood. So it wasn't specific to types of adversity, but just experiences of early life trauma. And they found indeed that it was associated significantly with challenges later in life, just as Jackie was saying earlier on about how in the context of the brain-based differences and all these experiences of adversity, these impacts can last a really long time and manifest in various ways. Though what we know from this previous research is kind of indirectly looking at the concept of ACEs and FASD, but very few studies have actually systematically measured or characterized ACEs in this population. And so that was the purpose of our study. So generally speaking, the idea or the purpose behind our study was to understand or quantify or better characterize ACEs, the classically measured ACEs within the FASD population. It was actually part of a larger study, and I don't have the history that Jackie does on this study because I joined the team later on, but as far as I have heard, this was part of a larger study that was designed to look at various risk and protective factors in terms of how they impact outcomes for people who are assessed for FASD in childhood. And so during the course of this larger research project, it became increasingly apparent to the researchers that environment, caregiving situation, early experiences of adversity were really significant and pronounced in this population of children they were looking at. And so it became apparent that this was a research question worthy of exploring more specifically. And so it ended up becoming a collaboration between Jackie and some other folks from the U of A and some of her students, and then I joined in later on from the Canada FASD Research Network, and we published this study that some of you may have read. What we did was, I say we, it wasn't me. I was not involved. I was not involved in this phase of the research, but what the research team did was reviewed retrospectively all of the clinical records of children and adolescents who visited a pediatric FASD diagnostic center in Alberta over about a span of a decade. So they reviewed over 300 files and pulled data from the files, primarily from social worker reports. They pulled data to correspond with a measurement of ACEs. So I mentioned earlier that early adversity has been explored in the FASD population prior to this study, but not quite as systematically. So they used the ACE questionnaire, which is a validated and widely used measure that has been used in many different populations and studies, used to collect information on 10 specific adverse childhood experiences, 3 different kinds of abuse, 2 different kinds of neglect, and 5 different kinds of household dysfunction. And so this tool was used retrospectively, where the research team looked into the old files and coded whether or not the child had experienced any of these 10 ACEs. And then in addition to those 10 classic ACEs, we also added another item on caregiver disruption, because of what we know in the literature about how kids with FASD are overrepresented in the child welfare system. And we know that there is a fairly substantial amount of disruption and instability in their caregiving environment. We wanted to also collect this one piece of information that is specific to that disruption piece. So in terms of the sample itself, the sample size ended up being over 300. So 333 children and adolescents were part of the study sample. The average age of kiddos in the study was 9.5, but they ranged in age from 0 to 17. The breakdown of sex was roughly equal. They were a little bit more males than females, but it was roughly half and half. And so what we learned, I'm going to go through some of these broader kind of takeaway lessons that we learned from this study. The paper itself has a list of other findings as well, but we just pulled a few broad findings that we think would be most relevant to this conversation today in terms of how we can respond and how we can better understand the kind of environmental situations. So to start off, one of the really significant and noteworthy findings in the study was the high degree of instability in the caregiving environment, which probably isn't surprising given what we know about this population already. If you look at the bottom of this table, you can see here we have broken down the number of placements that kiddos in the study had lived in throughout their lifespan. So we just broke it down into these various categories. On average, children and adolescents in the study had lived in 4 different placements across their lifetime. And I want to note here too that we excluded cases of movement because of divorce or remarriage. So we did not count those cases as a caregiving disruption. We only counted cases where kids were removed from their family situation and placed into a new family situation outside of divorce and remarriage. So on average, kids had experienced 4 different placements. Over half of, almost 60% of the sample had lived in 3 or more different home environments in their lifetime. Oops, I skipped one too quickly. And 14% had lived in 7 or more. And in fact, I was shocked to read this data that the highest number of living placements in this data set was 24. So one person in this sample had lived in 24 different placements across their lifetime. So this is just speaking to this. Oh, Jackie wants to say something. Yeah.
I have to jump in. I can't stand it. But, and I want to emphasize that this was the pediatric clinic. So even when Katie's saying lifetime, we're talking about childhood. So this is a clinic that is providing services to kids under the age of 18. So when Katie produces these numbers, these are in those developmental years, which, like Katie, to me is something really worth sitting back on our heels and thinking about a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really good point too, that I would like to return to afterwards, because most of the ACE research is done with adults. And so adults are surveyed about their own childhood experiences. So in this study, we only looked at kids and adolescents. And so the kiddos who are 3 years old have another 15 years to accumulate adverse childhood experiences that haven't not yet been counted. So for a number of reasons, we actually think that these numbers are underestimates compared to the actual reality of the adversity that these kiddos are experiencing. So thanks for emphasizing that, Jackie. The other important point here about caregiving instability or home instability is that the most common, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse when I'm like poking around here, I'm like drawing, okay, good. So here, the most common caregiving situation or home placement was foster care. So 1/3 of the kids lived in foster care, which is just another kind of indication of the level of instability or the kind of just the multiple placement kind of idea here. Another point that was really important for us to take away was that the participants in this study experienced a really high degree of complexity in terms of their clinical presentation. Although all of the participants in the study had confirmed prenatal alcohol exposure, only 2/3 of them were diagnosed with FASD. That means that 1/3 of them were not. And some of the reasons for not being diagnosed with FASD were that they were experiencing other things in their lives that may have been contributing to their difficulties and challenges, which just kind of goes to show how complex and how much is going on and how many layers of influence are at play here. Co-occurring mental health diagnoses were also exceptionally common in this sample. So on average, kids and adolescents in the study had at least one extra mental health diagnosis outside of FASD. So some kids had up to 5 extra mental health diagnoses. And so the most common of these were ADHD, which is common in kiddos with FASD. Depression and anxiety were experienced at high rates as well. A post-traumatic stress disorder, reactive attachment disorder. So this is just kind of speaking to the complexity and the extra layers of mental health that are relevant to this conversation. Another interesting point is that most of the kids, not all of the kids had available data on polysubstance or multiple substance exposures, but this gets at the prenatal exposures. So most kiddos actually had been exposed to other substances in addition to alcohol prenatally, which again just adds to the complexity of the picture. And then finally, kids had, or participants had a range of IQ scores ranging. So for those who aren't familiar, average IQ is 100. Kids ranged in IQ from 58 to 128, which just kind of, again, demonstrates the wide range of diversity in this population. Some kiddos cognitively were really, really quite impaired, where others were quite high functioning cognitively. And that just, again, goes to show that FASD is not a one size fits all kind of, label. It's actually very, very, very diverse and complex. So that is kind of like the demographic and clinical background. And then to get into the kind of meat of the study, we looked at ACEs from a couple of different ways. We sliced the data in various ways to get a better understanding of not only the rates, like just kind of the straight numbers of ACEs, but we also wanted to know which kinds of ACEs were more common, whether there were any kinds of individual factors like sex, age, living situation, whether those kinds of demographic variables influenced or were related at all to ACEs. And we also wanted to know whether the categories of ACEs differed across groups. So just to start off, I'll draw your attention to this top part of the table here where we report on the total ACE scores. So most kids have between 2 and 5 ACEs. The average ACE score was 3.5. So on average, kids experienced 3 or 4 adverse childhood experiences. This ranged from 0 to 9. And note, though, that this did not include caregiver disruption because that was not on the classic ACE questionnaire. And almost half of the sample had ACE scores of 4 or more. And I draw attention to this cutoff point because depending on the study, researchers will make their kind of categorizations or classifications of low, medium, high at different spots. But in the original classic ACE research, the cutoff of 4 and above was experienced in only 6% of that massive 10,000 participant study. So in the US general population, only 6% of adults experienced an ACE score of 4 or higher, which is remarkable, going back to what Jackie said about how these are children. They're from 0 to 17, on average 9 years old, and they're experiencing, almost half of them had 4 or more ACEs. Then we wanted to check and see whether we predicted that total ACE score would be related to a couple of different variables, and we correctly predicted, not surprisingly, that total ACE score went up as age went up. So as the participant got older, they experienced a higher number of ACEs. Also, as predicted, the number of mental health, co-occurring mental health diagnoses, the higher that number was, the higher number of ACEs the individual experienced. And then also the number of placements. So the total number of placements was significantly correlated with the total ACE score as well, which again, just kind of speaks to these added layers of complexity that we need to think about when we're trying to conceptualize adversity in this population. Oh, one last point on this slide. Most commonly, so you can see here on the right here that these are the 3 different kinds of abuse, 2 different kinds of neglect, and 5 different types of household dysfunction. Of these 10 ACEs, the most common, I think I even made a fancy box, yes. The most common were caregiver related. So not having lived with both biological parents. Almost the entire sample was living outside of their biological home. Almost 90% of the sample had some kind of disruption in their caregiving environment. And then the third most common ACE was exposure to substance use in the home. So this just kind of goes to show again how important and how influential that environment can be for kids with FASD and PAE. Then the other way that we wanted to look at the data was to kind of break it down and group participants based on certain demographic characteristics. So we wanted to know whether, as we expected, children would experience, children would experience different rates of ACEs than adolescents. And so we broke the participants down by preschoolers from 0 to 5 years, children from 6 to 12, and adolescents 13 to 17. And when we analyzed the data based on these kinds of age groups, we found that the only ones that remained significant were these 3 different kinds of abuse. So what we found was that adolescents and children had higher rates of sexual abuse and physical abuse than preschoolers, and children and adolescents combined had a higher rate of emotional abuse than preschoolers. So like I say, we sliced this data lots of different ways, and so we had to control for all these calculations, which meant that some of these findings did not remain significant after controlling for all these calculations. But before we move on, I want to draw your attention to just objectively the rates of adversity across, even though these rates were not significantly different, like 60% of preschoolers had exposure to substance abuse in the home. You know, all of these even though these were the only 3 remaining significant ones, this goes to show that even preschoolers experience significantly high rates and exceptionally high rates of ACEs kind of across the board. The next way that we wanted to look at it was analyzing whether males and females differed in terms of their experiences with ACEs. And we predicted, based on the previous literature, that females would experience higher rates because that's what's been shown in the general population. And we did see, you can look at these bar charts, across all but 1 ACE, females had higher rates, but only sexual abuse remained significant after we controlled for all of our calculations. And so, as you can see here, nearly 20% of participants who are female experienced sexual abuse. That was across the entire sample. We didn't break these down based on age group or any other demographic factor. We kind of lumped them back together, but again, it's just kind of a snapshot of what kinds of demographic factors might increase vulnerability in kids with PAE and FASD. And then finally, we looked at placement type. So we in some research in the past has shown that kids with PAE, and not just kids, I shouldn't be saying kids, adolescents who live in family-based placements versus system-based placements. So family-based placements would be things like biological parents or other family members or stable adoptive homes. And systems-based placements would be kids and adolescents who live in foster care or in group care. Past research has shown that people with PAE and FASD who live in system-based placements do tend to experience higher rates of adversity And so that's what we were predicting. And indeed, that's what we found across almost every ACE. Participants who lived in system-based placements had significantly higher rates of ACEs. I want to point out that the study was not longitudinal, it was a retrospective file review. So it's really challenging to make conclusions or interpretations based on this data. But one way that I think about this and kind of make sense of this is that ACEs may be more common. So this difference in terms of family and systems-based findings, it might be that because children experienced ACEs, they were removed from their homes and put into foster care or group homes. So that's just one way of making sense of this data. But unfortunately, because of our study design, we can't make any kind of interpretive or longitudinal kind of conclusions about, why these findings are the way they are. And also importantly, because it was a retrospective file review, we don't have much context around the experiences of these ACEs. That's one of the limitations of the ACE questionnaire, is that it doesn't tell us anything about the severity or the frequency or the timing of these experiences. And so while it gives us a really great snapshot of, I shouldn't say really great, actually quite a very dark snapshot of what's being experienced in this population, it's likely an underestimate of what's truly going on. So the kind of just takeaways to sum up everything that I've said very quickly in 20 minutes is that this population really experiences exceptionally high rates of early adversity. This is in comparison to the general population, and in comparison, we drew comparisons in the paper to other disability populations as well, because it's kind of widely known that people with disabilities tend to experience higher rates of adversity. But even in comparison to other disability groups, the rates that we found in this study were remarkably high. Sex and age matter. So females in this study tended to be more vulnerable towards adversity, as has been shown in the general population. Age also matters. So I know I mentioned that the preschoolers in this study did experience really, really high rates of adversity. And we'll talk about more of the implications of this later on, but just this kind of early recognition and early intervention and early support is just so critical to prevent kind of these trajectories towards negative outcomes. Another key point here, and I have this bidirectional arrow here because we found a relationship between mental health and ACEs, but we don't know, again, which direction that relationship is. Could it be that experiences of ACEs increase mental health, or is it the other way around? We really don't know, but we do know that they are associated. So mental health challenges are definitely associated with early adversity, as has again been shown in previous research where in the classic ACE studies, where they show higher rates of mental health concerns among people who have experienced high rates of early adversity. And to kind of bring it back to where we started around how the environment really matters. And the last 20 minutes I have spent talking about how potentially harmful or a potential of a risk factor the environment can be, and how much instability there seems to be for some kids with PE and FASD. It also gives us an opportunity to intervene, and it gives us a modifiable, the environment is modifiable, and the environment is we can offer supports, and we can kind of strengthen the environment and support children and caregivers in order to kind of mitigate these risks. And I think that's kind of where the direction that we want to take the rest of the conversation around how we can actually use the environment as an opportunity for support to promote positive outcomes. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jackie to kind of wrap everything up and give us kind of the big picture. So what does this all mean?
Well, we'll start that anyway. Thanks, Katie. And thanks for doing such a wonderful job of sharing all that information. As Katie just said, while she shared some data that revealed to us the high level of risk and vulnerability, and that we're looking at a population that has really high levels of exposure to adversity, this is not necessarily predetermined or necessary. And so that's where we really like to situate ourselves in what is the alternative? What can we do? What does the solution look like? And so identifying a concern is not about living in that, but about then thinking about from where do we go from here? So as a team, as a research team, and also just with working with community partners, when we think about some of the data like we see here, sometimes what we do is, as Katie accurately said, we can only say what we can say about a study. And so then we think about, how do we contextualize that? How do we make meaning of this in a way that we can take it to the next step? Because sometimes research is kind of slow, and we want to situate it in something meaningful. Sometimes the first thing we do is we go back to our school books and we say, well, let's look at some theory. And let's first of all remind ourselves about how important environment is. And so on the next slide, you'll see that we've just sort of situated here within one theory, and ecological systems sets. So there's lots of theories that look at ecological systems. These are what a lot of any of you guys who are developmental specialists out there will be very familiar with this, and very familiar with some of the theorists like Broff and Brenner, who said environment matters, and that children, individuals, we don't grow up in isolation, we grow up within context, and our families matter, our extended community matters, even our society matters, and that all of these things contribute to who we're going to be. And so this is a really critical theory, and some of you might look back and go, oh, I remember once reading about Broff and Brenner. Yeah, so what? We put ourselves in this because it puts us in a place which creates environment not just as a risk factor, but as a formative factor, and allows us to change the language. So even though we know for individuals with FASD, environment is disproportionately a risk, it doesn't have to be so. And there is lots of good theory that tells us environment is simply a formative factor. And so that's something that we've adopted a little bit as we've thought about it, and thought about not only our work, but how we can link the work that we've done to a lot of other really great research that talks about how we can leverage that formative factor, the environment. On the next slide, I hone in a little bit more closely here. Again, I'm still living in the land of theory, and so bear with me, but this is important stuff. And so even within these ecological models, where we say children exist within all of these context factors, when we look carefully at the context factors, we appreciate that there is a transactional process that occurs. So children influence parents, and parents influence the children. And so it's not even a one-way street. It's not like children sit in the middle of those models and are simply passive recipients. There's a transactional factor. So when Katie shared with you a little bit about the relationship between mental health and adversity, or when we think about the complexities that exist when we look at the elevated rates of adversity, transactional models can be really important for us to remember, because they say that environment is not sort of an isolated place in space. So we're looking at children who have prenatal alcohol exposure, whose brains have developed differently and uniquely, who may not always behave or interact with folks in predictable or anticipated ways. This can create a lot of challenges for caregivers. This can be really difficult for caregivers who may face their own challenges, may be experiencing their own stresses, and are also trying to form attachments and bonds and interact with children in meaningful ways. But they're not interacting back in the way they'd expect, because their brains have developed uniquely. So environment lives in this transactional place where there is back and forth. And it's not simple enough to say the environment is good or the environment is bad, but rather to say the dynamics that are occurring in here are not healthy. So what can we do to increase the healthiness of these environmental factors? How can we improve that? It becomes the question that we ask, and it allows us, at least in Jackie land, to step out of who we want to blame or how we want to point fingers, and rather say, this is the transactional process. And the more we can identify early on what unique needs there are within families, within children, and within communities, the better we may be able to leverage some strengths and facilitate healthy transactions and healthy interactions. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about some of the research specific to FASD that tells us that yes, indeed, we can, and that we can operationalize, breathe life into these models when we appreciate the dynamics that are going on. And that these, when we do that, we're seeing some positive outcomes. We're seeing healthier families. We're seeing kids that are developing with healthier outcomes. The third kind of piece that I want to kind of speak to is that this isn't all about environment, and it isn't, just a matter of those pieces, but rather as we shift and influence the environment, we're not just changing the observed behavior of parent and or child, but it actually influences underlying brain. And I saw in the chat, somebody had posted, was it Christina? A link to an article regarding some of the brain-based changes when kids are placed in permanent care. Awesome, check it out, because it's true. Our brains and the way that brains develop through childhood are strongly influenced by environment. This slide that we've got up here right now is an older slide. I realize that, but I use it because I like it. I sometimes just like some, something that's really clear. And in this research study, the researchers expose these animals, and in this case, it's animals because sometimes we have high levels of control when we work with animals. So we can control environment and brain in a way we can't and won't with people, in order to understand what might be possible and then extend that to human beings. So in this study, the researchers exposed these mice to alcohol prenatally. So they knew that their brains had developed differently and were affected. Then what they did is they put these animals in different environments so that they could determine the extent to which an environment might have an impact on brain development and brain growth, even for individuals affected by prenatal alcohol exposure. What they found was the more enriched the environment, the better the fit the environment was for that individual, the more it created conditions for healthy growth and functioning in these mice. And you see the pictures below that show the neuron that is much better developed in those mice who are in that enriched cage. This is simple, and there's some really great research being done right now in terms of brain-based differences in individuals who have experienced adversity, but also who have then experienced stability. And so this is just an example of something that demonstrates sort of in what to me is a very tangible way, the change that's possible. But this is something that is being demonstrated in lots of bodies of literature, both with individuals who have prenatal exposure as well as those who do not, to demonstrate that what we do in an environment, how we influence environment, doesn't just change behavior that's exhibited, but as we might expect, is actually changing the underlying brain function. Katie said something when she was talking, and she talked about the long-term impacts of environment. And that's part of why there are long-term impacts to environment, because it actually contributes to the way our brains grow and develop, which is not just about having a behavioral habit, but actually having brain-based differences that contribute to the way we behave and the kinds of difficulties or successes that we might experience. In particular, we see it a lot in relational interactions. And for those of you who are used to the research around adversity and trauma and relationships, you know that relationships are particularly impacted by some of these early life experiences and brain-based differences. So moving on, when we talk about brain and we're talking about an environment, really the way in which we're hoping to shift the conversation, Katie and I today, is to really think about the opportunities for growth within environment. Growth that can occur at a basic genetic level. When we look at the work that's being done in epigenetics, we understand that genetic expression is in part influenced by environmental differences. The stronger and more nurturing an environment, regardless of whether you have prenatal alcohol exposure or not, the more we can access genetic potential and shift the way in which a genetic expression occurs. When we appreciate the importance of environment, we can look at proactive intervention. We can get in, and as Katie said, we can early identify the needs of individuals, recognize those developmental differences, and implement proactive intervention. We can capitalize on environmental experiences. We can recognize that environment is something that we can build on. This means that we can work specifically with families and caregivers. We can think about what it means to really invest in support for our caregivers. Anyone who's heard me talk before will know that I think that caregivers are some of our strongest assets when it comes to supporting individuals with FASD. Caregivers do so much for creating opportunity for individuals with FASD, investing in individuals who are providing those caregiving environments, really thinking about what it means to come alongside our caregivers. I cannot say enough about how much I think that is an important thing for us to do, is early on and through the lifespan. Finally, leveraging individual differences means that even as we do all of this, we can be conscious of the fact that there are individual factors, that child that sits in the middle of that Bruff and Brenner ecosystem, that we can be aware of. So when we're thinking about environment, we're thinking about some of the differences and the strengths that individual may bring that we can leverage to help facilitate that transactional interaction between caregiver or other environmental source and that child. All of these, I think, provide us with ways that we could think about the potential for growth and ways in which we, within our organizations and places of support, can be thinking about the things that we can do to promote growth opportunities for individuals with FASD. So on the next slide, I just review a few of the specific studies that have been done and areas that have been researched for individuals with FASD. These 5 circles reflect some conclusions that have been drawn coming from multiple studies. Actually, none of these is just one single study. This is just me pulling some themes out of multiple studies because researchers have found this in a few different cases. So, for example, one of the things that contributes to healthy outcomes, very in keeping with the way we've sort of situated this within these ecological models, is that supporting healthy families and helping to build parenting capacity leads to healthier outcomes for individuals with FASD, and in fact, healthier outcomes for the entire family, no surprise, which is important. Researchers have found that meaningful understanding of behavior and support with caregivers in terms of their own self-regulation and emotional regulation can have really positive impacts. This takes us back to what we were saying even right at the beginning of the presentation, where we were really underscoring the fact that individuals with FASD are born with unique brains. Their brains are functioning differently. Their areas of strength and difficulty may not always be what we expect. Their ability to attach, connect, and communicate with us may not always make sense. Their way of expressing their frustration or discouragement or uncertainty may not always be something that we like to see, know how to handle, or know what to do with. So the more we can understand the way in which the unique brain development is contributing to the behavior that we're seeing and not understanding, realizing it's not that my child doesn't love me, it's that they express their love differently. This is going to look different. And then appreciating that how I'm reacting and how I'm managing my own emotions, because being a parent is hard. No matter what. Being a parent when you're working with a kiddo with FASD, where you're also trying to manage translation and understanding and respond to much more difficult behavior than otherwise, of course it's going to be hard to regulate. So what are we doing to support those caregivers and giving them places and spaces to be healthy themselves, to be supported and validated in the emotions that they're experiencing, and then realize what it means to be calm and to be centered in the way that they're approaching and interacting with their kiddos. Supporting caregivers, oh, it matters so much. Relational approaches. Lots of research has really emphasized the positive value of relational approaches in the interventions that we provide. This can include things like mentoring, whether it be a mother mentoring or a youth mentoring program. Success coaches is something that we've seen in Alberta schools, where we're seeing mentoring programs facilitating relationships between kids, educators, and community supports. all of these relational approaches where we walk alongside the individual with FASD, building positive relationship and helping to facilitate the process of interdependence in their interactions with systems of support and just with the world in general, have really demonstrated some positive impacts. And positive impacts, not just in terms of attaining increased positive outcomes like completing school, for example, but also in terms of helping that individual see themselves in a different light as somebody who's more competent, who's more worthy of support, of interaction, of positive, healthy relationship, and who then can also go on to build a healthier relationship themselves. Stability and proactivity within placements. Dr. Dorothy Badri, a member of CanFASD, has written a lot about the importance of stability and proactivity within placements, particularly for children who are children's services involved. She's written just some really compelling work that says how important it is for us to really provide for a higher level of stability, or set a higher standard for stability for these kiddos. And finally, nurture resiliency and provide support as needed. And this really speaks to a bit more of a balance in the way that we provide support within these ecosystems, within these environments. Meaning, if we balance our concern and our worries for an individual with some appreciation of their strengths and the potential for their resiliency, then we can shift our focus away from just those worries into, let's foster some strengths, let's leverage opportunities or create space for these individuals to experience success. That changes that transactional dynamic, and that creates a space where individuals actually begin to see themselves as actually capable of some kind of success. And maybe the pathway is very windy, and maybe we're not entirely even sure what that pathway looks like. But certainly within our environments, ensuring that all of our partners and everybody who is wrapping around and working with and alongside this individual with FASD is not just doing so to avoid a problem, but rather to promote resiliency, leverage a strength, and create conditions whereby success is possible. We're starting to shift the story, and we start to shift that expectation. And it's still certainly within what is appropriate for that individual. Expectations have to be well suited, but it's still about having some expectations and looking towards pathways that might promote success. So just into the next slide, and continuing to kind of think about some of this research and particularly these pieces around perspective and how much perspective does matter, is looking at the work that's been done. And these are a couple of studies, and some of this work has been done. Actually, Christy Petrenko has done some really lovely work. And if you've looked at her work or seen it, it's just some really nice work where she's looking at how we really support caregivers, and how by having better understanding, we can move away from punishment, we can move away from responses that reflect some of our frustration, and increasingly look towards how understanding behavior allows us to use appropriate strategies to prevent that misbehavior, or to help individuals meet the needs that they have in more appropriate ways. And in doing so, they've identified, Christy and her team has talked a lot about how caregivers express reduced frustration, they feel more competent, they feel more able to meet the needs of their kiddos, and also are more successful in managing behavior. So the outcomes are not just about kiddos, they're, again, transactional. Everything is back and forth. It's really hard to talk about kids without talking about caregivers or support systems, because they influence each other. Back to that transactional model, and there's good reason for it. Looking forward to the next slide. I'm restating a little bit here as well around the responsive strategies, and then improving caregiver understanding helps to increase their skill set, which helps to improve the child's functioning and reducing parents' distress. So like I said, there's been a few studies that have found this, and it's interesting, and I shouldn't be surprised at all. I just love it when sometimes we have good ideas and good intention, and we think we've got it figured out, but then we do the research and we go, oh, this didn't actually sit the way I thought it would. Okay, I've just shifted my understanding a little bit. What's been really exciting to me is, as this work is emerging, and it's still preliminary and we're still learning, is that the extent of the differences that we are measuring, and as we really support caregivers and enhance these environments for caregivers, and I keep saying caregivers, and just I'm going to pause for a minute, because I think Dorothy Reed's here and she's going to really hold me to task if I don't also note, I think she is anyway, that caregivers don't just necessarily just have to be those parent figures. They can include educators, community support people, extended family, and ideally that caregiving network can be large. So I want to just distribute responsibility a little bit before I, overburden the caregivers even further. And so I said that really carefully. Yeah, Dorothy, I knew as I was talking, I'm like, wait a minute, let me back that up, because that ecological model isn't just saying caregivers, it's saying let's extend that. We need to appreciate that. I was reading an interesting article. I won't digress for long. I know people are looking at the clock, me too. But I've been reading a lot more lately about cooperative parenting, and the idea of cooperative parenting or cooperative caregiving, and that even as human beings, we're not actually designed for the nuclear family model. Like this idea of mother, father, and kiddos, and that's your caregiving unit, is actually not really how human beings came to be. And that when we look at cooperative parenting models or cooperative caregiving models, where we appreciate the fact that caregivers can be many in a child's life. And in fact, when they are many, children thrive, and it creates much more opportunity. It offloads some of the burden from two people to actually being an integrated system of support, and that all children, whether they have FASD or otherwise, really benefit from these integrated, diverse, coordinated caregiving contexts. So I know I'm going off on a tangent, but I think it's really important, because I think it has significant impact in terms of how we think about supporting coordinated caregiving opportunities in our communities. That was a lot of C's. Katie, do you want to move us on before I really start making some kind of alliteration, or worse yet, break out into a rap?
Can I say, I would love to hear the rap, but I just, before we move from that point, I just want to really emphasize what you said about taking some of the pressure off of caregivers, because I think that we put a lot on caregivers, not just of those with FASD, but just parents in general are living under so much pressure. And I think that not overemphasizing, but only emphasizing the importance of caregiver approaches and regulation and these things can just feel really overwhelming. And so it's nice how you say, just to kind of spread the responsibility a little bit, and not in terms of like, I can't handle this, but in terms of my child will do better when there's a whole system of support.
Hands down, Katie. Stephanie, I just saw you post something about normalizing respite. And, yeah, I mean, and even the word respite, should it even be respite? Like, I know I'm breaking it down and splitting hairs here, but if we're doing coordinated care and caregiving, then it's just another caregiving role. It's not respite. It's just part of your caregiving network. Maybe we need to reframe this and restore it within our communities and think about these as necessary conditions of caregiving and for everybody. And it's not that a caregiver can't do it or needs respite because they're so exhausted. It's because we're better when caregiving is distributed. So I think these are the kinds of things that we can think about that are really nicely evidence informed, and we can start from a study that says, okay, this is the data that tells us this is a really important issue, and now let's pull together all of this other data that tells us that this issue reveals a tremendous opportunity, and the data tells us that we can't not talk about it. The data that we collected and that Katie has produced here says this is a paramount importance. This is not something we can say, yeah, okay, we'll get it. No, this is a priority item. And really asking ourselves what our coordinated care can look like, what we can do as a community. And on this slide, we're talking a little bit about integrated intervention and looking at intervention efforts as all integrated and together. And it's something that we talk about a lot, is putting it all together. And I would almost think about all of these elements. You know, we have parent and caregiver supports there on one wheel, but I think all of these would have elements of caregiving within them. So even if we think about this as actually a sphere of elements of caregiving and different components of caregiving, I really think that we can maybe start thinking about how we message that in our communities. I don't know, Katie, what do you think? Am I off on a total tangent now?
Nope, not at all. I love your tangents anyway, but yeah, I think one thing that you said that really resonated with me is that this just reveals so much opportunity. And I think that when we think about integrated intervention models or even cooperative care models, to me, it's the complexity and the multiple layers of the story almost give us more opportunity and more opportunities to intervene and support and chances to do things differently in different ways, suited for different people, for different caregivers, for different kind of situational contexts, because it's so dynamic and nothing is set in stone. And to have the opportunity to intervene on so many different levels with the potential to kind of facilitate, well-being, I think it's actually quite hopeful.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, and with the research that's being done, it's nice to be able to take what I think probably community members are like, but, having the evidence that really is growing right now to support this might help to catalyze some of these initiatives and help us to say, okay, these are things that are working and these are things that we need to distribute. And this is part of why, even as we started, I said, planting the seed, the nugget is to have a discussion, is that this is having opportunities for some discussion to say, how do we do this better is critical. How do we do this? And how can we learn from each other to become increasingly coordinated and integrated? Why don't we just flip forward and we can get ourselves into that discussion here. This is, for those of you who haven't seen it, I do share this a little bit. This is our healthy outcomes model, which speaks to some of the things that we're talking about in terms of integrating the research into a model, and that hopefully creates some support with translation that we are continuing to work with and build. So we'll flip past that. But if you haven't seen it, shoot me a note, and it's something that we're hoping to increasingly operationalize. Thanks for posting that, Andrew.
Thank you so much again for this amazing presentation, Jackie and Katie. I would like also to thank each one of you who would join us today, and hope you would join us in future webinars. And speaking of which, both SPI and CanFASD are hosting a series of webinars of interest to clinicians, caregivers, and service providers. So to get more information on upcoming webinars and to view past webinars, you can go to skprevention.ca and click on the Learning Opportunity tab. And also information on CanFASD and their webinar series can be found at canfasd.ca and the CanFASD YouTube channel. Follow CanFASD on Twitter and the CanFASD blog or their other social media channels to be aware of the latest FASD research, resources, and events. Many thanks to everyone, and hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to be here today.
Thanks a lot.